It's just gone past 4 o'clock here on the Eastern time zone. My name is Jesse Zink, and I want to offer you a warm virtual welcome to Montreal and Montreal Diocesan Theological College. I'm the principal here of DIO, and we're delighted to be hosting this book launch today for this book, which we all know we're here for, Partnership as Mission, Essays in Memory of Ellie Johnson. My job here is to host and to facilitate, so I want to get out of the way here in just a minute and turn it over to some of the panelists and speakers we have today. But before we do, I just wanted to say a word about why DIO and why Montreal should be hosting an event for this. I first came across the name Ellie Johnson when I was doing research, archival research in the history of how Anglicans have thought about mission, and found Canada and this name Ellie Johnson often linked together in relation to mission commissions in the 1990s and 2000s across the broader Anglican communion. But it wasn't until I actually came to Montreal that I actually learned more about Ellie Johnson, in part because she was, of course, a graduate twice over of McGill University, the university just across the street from us, with which we are so closely affiliated. And if you read this book, you'll see that DIO has gave Ellie a honorary doctorate in recognition of her great commitment to and service to the church. And Sue Wynn, who's here with us on this call, wrote and delivered that citation in 2006, I believe, and you can read the full citation, which is an excellent snapshot of Ellie's wonderful and diverse ministry. So that's why I think DIO's involved in this, because of the connection to Montreal and the connection that we've had to Ellie Johnson in the past. But I want to step out of the way now and turn things over to people who were much more closely involved with Ellie and her work, and people who worked so hard to put this book together. And I want to begin by inviting Maylanne Maybee. Maylanne is one of the co-editors of this book. Maylanne worked in Church House on staff with and for Ellie Johnson for about 14 years in the 1990s and 2000s before making a transition into the field of theological education and into ending up here in Montreal as my colleague. So it's a great delight, Maylanne, to turn things over to you and to welcome you to tell us about this book. After Maylanne has introduced the book, I'll come back on and tell you a little bit more about the panelists that we have today to introduce us and guide us through this book. Over to you, Maylanne.
Thanks so much, Jesse. How wonderful it is to see your faces. So thank you very much for coming to this very exciting gathering. So this book, Partnership as Mission, is an important book. It's an important book about an important person and an important time in the life of the church. And it's also a book for an important time in the life of our country and our world and planet. So Ellie Johnson died 2 years ago at about this time. My colleague Ken Gray described her as a tough and talented leader, good words, who lived and worked in many contexts, including General Synod of the Anglican Church of Canada, where she started out as a mission educator and then became the director of partnerships for the years that I worked there, from 94 to 2008. Actually, I started there in 1996. And for that period of time, she was my boss and mentor, but she became a really good friend for many more years, though sadly not nearly enough. When I came on staff, I knew some things about mission, but for me and the wider church, she completely rebranded the notion and concept of mission. And when my colleague Ken Gray, learning about her death, dropped a hint that he was looking for help to compile a book in her memory, I said yes without hesitation, though I have hesitated a few times thereafter, I must say. And I will leave it to Ken to describe later what inspired him to undertake this visionary and dedicated project. The time from conception to publication was accomplished in less than 2 years. And that says a lot about the contributors and their relationship with Ellie and their readiness to respond and write chapters and endure editing and to bring it to completion in such a short period of time. So we had a vision for this book, deciding early on that we wanted it to be both academic and personal. And so it is. It is a story about Ellie, but also about the reshaping of mission that she inspired, and then brought those circles full circle to the present. It's a story of missions and missionaries, of colonialism and decolonizing, of the shift from social justice to environmental justice to eco-justice, of the church's complicity in residential schools and the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and globally. But above all, it's a story, they are stories of transformative change and the moments that went with it sometimes of deep discouragement and loss that inevitably accompany such change. So you'll find in this book a section of memories of and tributes to Ellie herself from her daughters and friends and colleagues whose lives she touched so deeply. It includes, as Jesse mentioned, the citation and her response when Dio awarded her a doctoral degree in divinity, honoris causa, in 2006. There's a section on her institutional role in the church at a time when the church as an institution was becoming deeply compromised. And through these times, she navigated General Synod and the wider church so effectively, always drawing on the principle of partnership. Partnership in the sense of mutuality, collaboration, struggle, compromise, encounter, and respect. You'll find essays about strategic planning and eco-justice, about partnership as a step along the way to decolonization, about friendship as foundational to the practice of global mission. There's a section on partnerships with Indigenous peoples in Canada and beyond. No account of Ellie's influence and ministry would be complete without reflections on her work on alternative dispute resolution and working with residential schools survivors, a work that she accomplished with great sensitivity, diligence, and humility. It's the kind of work that it includes and extends to faithful and deep listening, repentance, painstaking archival research, willingness to change landscapes and labels, and the daily task of rooting out racism. You will read about these stories. And then another layer of these concentric circles is about the world today. You'll find prophetic voices, including Jesse's and others here, about the climate crisis and housing, about theological education, about the vocabulary of eco-justice, about the extinction of the caribou. You will get perspectives from Quebec, from central BC, from Franciscan spirituality. And then finally, you will read about Ellie's work in her own voice. It's an important book about an important person and an important time in the life of the church. And it's also a book of important collaboration or partnership between Ken and me as co-editors and with our contributors who so tolerated the process of editing and deadlines, and with our readership as well. So that's a brief description. I invite Ken at the end of this webinar to tell you where and how to buy the book and his own story and perspective of this collaboration. But from there, I would like to turn it over to Jesse and to our key presenters. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Maylanne, and thank you for orienting us to the book and its many sections. This is actually the second launch for this book that has taken place this week. There was one yesterday in the Toronto area at Ellie's Old Church, which was very well attended, a celebration of her life and also an introduction to this book. For this gathering, since it's online, however, we wanted to reach as far as we could and to draw in voices who knew Ellie in different capacities and who also have been deeply engaged in mission in the Anglican Communion. And so I want us now to hear from our two guests. The first is Ian Douglas. Ian I'll put you on the screen in just a minute, but Ian Douglas is the retired Bishop of Connecticut in the Episcopal Church. Prior to that, he taught mission and world Christianity at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And throughout his ministry and career, he's been deeply involved in the Anglican Communion, serving on the design group for the 2008 Lambeth Conference, serving on the Anglican Consultative Council on the Standing Committee of the Anglican Communion. He's the author of several books, author or editor of several books, including Fling Out the Banner, A History of Mission in the Episcopal Church, and editor of the still very important and widely read book, Beyond Colonial Anglicanism. And Ian worked with and served with Ellie on IASCOM, the Inter-Anglican Standing Committee on Mission and Evangelism, where they worked together in the late 90s and 2000s to help the Anglican Communion develop its understanding of mission. So in just a moment, I'll turn it over and welcome Ian from retirement to us here in Montreal. After Ian, we'll hear from Alyson Barnet-Cowan, who's with us, who was also at the book launch yesterday, I believe. So you get a gold star among a couple other people here for being at both this week. Alyson has also been deeply involved in the work of mission in Canada and in the broader Anglican Communion. She worked with Ellie and overlapped with Ellie on the staff of the General Synod Office in Toronto, when Alyson was in the role of Director of Faith, Worship, and Ministry, before moving on to the Anglican Communion Office in London as best job title in the church, I think, Director of UFOs, Unity, Faith, and Order for the Anglican Communion Office, where Alyson also served as Acting Secretary General, too, for a time, I believe, and now joins us from retirement in Toronto. So thank you, Ian and Alyson, for being with us. Ian, I'm going to invite you to go first and offer us an engagement with this book and a way into it. So over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for including me and inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I want to begin by expressing my deep appreciation to Ken and Maylanne. Is that how you pronounce it, Maylanne?
Maylanne.
Maylanne. For your inspiration and hard work in bringing this wonderful collection together. It's so important to have a festschrift that honors such a key person in the life of the Anglican Communion. And I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective of the wider inter-Anglican matters and not so much from within the context of the Anglican Church in Canada. It's so important to not only memorialize, but continue the work that Ellie had dedicated her life to with respect to really encouraging Christians in her home country and around the world to be first and foremost focused on the mission of God and dedicated to the mission of God. And in that, a mission that is fundamentally about reconciliation, restoration, wholeness, and justice, and our baptismal vocation to that work. So this book is not only a celebration of the life and work of Ellie Johnson, it's also an invitation to continue that work for all of us. So I think it's a wonderful festschrift, and I want to begin with that appreciation. I do want to make a few comments about the book from my perspective within Inter-Anglican matters. Ellie and I served together, as Jesse noted, on the Inter-Anglican Standing Commission on Mission and Evangelism, a long title with, of course, Anglican Communion acronyms known as IASCOM. And that was a commission that had been called into being through the Anglican Consultative Council and basically convened in 1999 and served really from 2000 to 2005 with reports to two of the Anglican Consultative Council meetings, both the 12th and the 13th meetings of the ACC. And here, the work of the Standing Commission on Mission and Evangelism in this book Communion in Mission, which is a combination of the two, which is a collection of the two reports that we put together for ACC, for the Anglican Consultative Council meeting. And here I want to note what I believe was a very important contribution of the Commission, and really led in many ways by Ellie. And it's an unsung and unnoted story that perhaps if I offer it here, it'll help to flesh out the third section of the book under the auspices of Church House. I believe that's what the third section is called, Church House, which really, that section is greater than simply Church House. It's really Anglican communion life. So maybe if this was next version, volume 2, Church House / Anglican communion life, because it really does note a lot of her work, with, of course, the other commitments with respect to Indigenous peoples, the place of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and also her commitments to eco-justice. But going back to the Anglican communion matters, those times, as you might remember, from really the first half of the first decade of the 20th century, were really quite tense times in the Anglican communion, and tense times for the Anglican Church in Canada and the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Episcopal Church. Of course, people tend to think of the presenting issue being the full inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people in the life of the church. Of course, it was 2002 that the Diocese of New Westminster, with Bishop Ingham, and moved to embrace the blessing of same-sex unions, causing quite a stir in the Anglican communion. And then in 2003, the church in New Hampshire, the Diocese of New Hampshire, electing Jean Robinson as the first out gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. That caused a significant upheaval across the communion, and many of the structural manifestations of the church were rallying around to see how can we contain, my words, this new wrinkle in the life of the Anglican communion. There were various and sundry, what I would also describe as instrumentalist approaches to trying to respond to the Episcopal Church in the States and the Anglican Church of Canada. Such matters as the Windsor Commission coming with the Windsor Report, that really one offering out of the Windsor Report was, could we have some kind of covenant? Now, sadly, I think the kind of covenant that was offered from the Windsor Report was more of a contract than a covenant. How can we agree not to do anything that would upset the other, as compared to what does it mean to respond to the Spirit's leading in our contexts? And the Inter-Anglican Standing Commission on Mission and Evangelism believed that the offerings of the Windsor Commission and the proposal around the covenant were short-sighted, in that it had more to do with maintaining the unity of the church than necessarily participating in the mission of God in the world. Not surprising that the Commission on Mission and Evangelism would come down more on the side of mission and finding our unity in participating in God's mission, rather than an instrumentalist approach to trying to enforce acceptable behaviors across a communion. And so, in our offering to ACC 13, you'll see that we offered a covenant for a communion in mission. A covenant for a communion in mission. And the idea for covenanting around mission rather than covenanting around structural unity, really was led by Ellie. Ellie said, our life of the church is not about who's in and who's out, but it's about how faithful we are to the mission of God. And Ellie, those of you who know her, she sometimes would be a little bit self-deprecating and say, well, you know, I'm not a theologian. Well, first of all, I'd say, hooey on that, Ellie. You're an incredible theologian. But by looking at the world as a social anthropologist, and I would underscore as a woman, and as a layperson, in way too many circles that are informed by clerical male theologians like me, it was Ellie who was able to bring a new perspective and challenge us as to perhaps the emperor's new clothes or the bishop's new chasuble, and say, wait a minute, what are we really about here? And so I just want us to celebrate and lift up and appreciate Ellie at a very important time, at much cost to herself, I believe, saying, challenging the church to be genuine to our original vocation, which is to participate in the Missio Dei, that restoring, reconciling action of God in the world. And when we do that, we will find our unity. It's in participating in the mission of God that we will find our unity, not in trying to follow some kind of instruments that get to define who's in and who's out. So for her boldness, for her, and I don't use this word lightly because it's tossed off all too easily, for her prophetic call, meaning calling us back to what God is about in the world, I just give thanks. And, you know, thank you for putting this book together. And I look forward to talking more about Ellie in other quadrants of her life in the church in Canada. So I think that's my 10 minutes, right, Jesse?
Well, thank you. And thank you for keeping the time. Always appreciated. We're going to have some time for discussion and questions and comments. But before we get there, I want to say thank you to Ian and Alyson. I want to bring you forward as well and hear from you.
Thank you very much. Full disclosure, I was a member of the Lambeth Commission on Communion that produced the Windsor Report, and for my sins. And to my surprise, I was the most liberal person on it, but had to go along with the consensus in the end. My views about all this will be made clear in a couple of minutes. But I have to say, all those years of agony over the blessing of same-sex unions, and doesn't the Pope just go and say, it's fine, go ahead? Oh my. Anyway, what a wonderful reminder this book is of what I really consider to have been golden times in the life of the Anglican Church of Canada and of the Anglican Communion. Before the worst of the residential school system was revealed, and before the great sex debates raged within and among provinces, there was a time that seems, in retrospect at least, to have been one of true global partnership and collaboration. Terry Brown's reflection on the shift from the understanding of the church's mission to God's mission, the Missio Dei, is a really good summing up of the thinking that underlined the church's work in the 1980s and 1990s. Starting with the 1963 Anglican Congress and mutual responsibility and interdependence in the body of Christ, the Anglican Communion took on a new force and a new identity, no longer the Church of England abroad following the empire, but a commonwealth of churches, each with their own gifts and integrity. The Partners in Mission program that grew out of that Anglican Congress saw teams of visits from across the Communion come to live within the context of member churches and to reflect with them. And this made it possible for deep relationships to form across international borders and to allow the light of the gospel to shine in new ways on the church's life. I had the experience of having been visited by a Partners in Mission team when I was at the Henry Budd College for Ministry, and it was frankly a little uncomfortable, but uncomfortable in a good way, as people from outside of my context saw what was going on and offered some critique and some ways forward from their context. That PIM process was time-consuming and very expensive, but it truly strengthened the bonds of affection, which Anglicans often say they value. Learning and action became mutual. Then came a time, as Ian has alluded, when the pressures around sexuality and biblical interpretation led the communion to try to find a way to govern itself through the covenant process. But Anglicans in many places, not least in Canada and in England, resisted the temptation to be a worldwide church. Unfortunately, that failed process also left us drifting back into isolationism. Churches no longer visit each other very much. In that way, we are also in sync with the world, which instead of coming together to do something about the pressing dangers of climate change, is giving way to nationalist authoritarian regimes. But Ellie Johnson, for whom this book is written, would not want me only to complain and paint a bleak picture. She was always a person of hope, hope grounded in faith and also tied to the realities of life. What I yearn for is a revitalization of that sense of Missio Dei. What is God doing now in the world, and what can we do to help? We, not as white British Canadian Anglicans, but we as the emerging church in Canada, which is made up, first of all, by Indigenous people who unexpectedly, perhaps given what was done to them, are faithfully developing patterns of worship and ministry which work in their contexts. A church which is made up also of Anglicans from all over the world who have come as immigrants and refugees and who enliven our communities, which might otherwise have been tempted to sink into mourning for our lost significance in society. What can this Anglican community do to participate in God's mission in a nation besieged by racism, consumerism, poverty, homelessness, and addiction? And at the communion level, I yearn for a revitalization of the vision of MRI. The Anglican Communion no longer has a mission desk. It has an evangelism desk. And I hope that this does not mean that it is going back to the days of mission to others by the church. We as a communion can only be strong, as Ian has said, if we are meeting one another as equals in God's mission in the world. Where there continue to be strength and partnership is in the networks of the Anglican Communion. The networks bring together knowledgeable and impassioned people from the churches of the communion to work together on particular issues: peace and justice, Indigenous, women, environment, family, health and community, safe church. Our colleague Eileen Scully is at this moment in Kuala Lumpur with the Safe Church Network. These all operate on principles of partnership and embrace and further the 5 marks of mission. But the principles of partnership and mission can be applied locally as well. As Michael Shapcott puts out in his essay in the book, the pressing question of housing in this country can best be addressed when communities and builders work together to provide affordable housing that is not just a roof and walls, important as those are, but are also warm homes where hospitality and food can be shared, where community can gather. And it's the people who lack housing who need to be the real partners in developing suitable housing. Perhaps in your community, there is some urgent need. I'm sure there is. Rather than just give money to a cause, why not get down and dirty and become real neighbors to the people facing that situation? Rather than suggest a solution from outside, collaborate so that solutions emerge from the people who are experiencing the crisis. That's the dream of partnership. All over our country, there are many people who want to be involved in the long-term call of reconciliation between settlers and Indigenous people. We are in a post-residential schools crisis, perhaps precisely because the dominant class, the moneyed class, the powerful class, thought it had the solution to other people's perceived problems and imposed that solution on them. To effect true reconciliation, that has to be turned right around. Indigenous people have been saying for a long time that they know how to care for the land and for the water and for all living creatures in the territory for which they have been made guardians by the Creator. And it's time that all of us listen to their wisdom for a change. Thank you. I think I even beat the 10 minutes.
Well done. Thank you both. You've done a great job of keeping to time. So I want to thank Ian and Alyson. And we now have time for some discussion, some questions or answers, or provocations. I gather that at the book launch yesterday, there were people there who'd already engaged with and read the book and wanted to ask specific questions. But this is also a time to talk about our own experiences of mission and ask questions of Ian and Alyson. We have Maylanne here and Ken as well. As you may have noticed, we are recording this, and that's so it can be shared later. So that does mean if you ask a question, it will be recorded. If you don't want your question to be recorded, you can always put it in the chat screen. And if you don't want anybody to see your question, you can chat just directly to me privately. Just you click on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of my box and click chat, and it'll come directly to me, and I'll give voice to your question without attaching your name to it. If you have a question or comment to make, you can use the raise your hand function. You can put a comment in the chat screen as well. I'm going to take the privilege, though, of asking the first question, and it's a question I want to ask of both. Well, I'll just put it out there for both Ian and Alyson. You've both given us, taken us back, really a generation to the 1990s, the 2000s. Alyson, you used the phrase a kind of golden age, looking a little bit further back in the life of the Anglican Church of Canada, when this idea of partnership was flourishing, and then also at a time when partnership seemed like a really important response to the trials and travails of the Anglican Communion. So I guess my question then is, things have changed. You know, there is a climate crisis that is even more obvious now than it was 20 years ago. Alyson, as you say, Anglicans travel less around the world to interact with one another. There's lots of reasons for that. Surely one of them is financial, but surely also one of them is a sense that people are just more withdrawn. So when we think about this idea of partnership, how has it changed in what it means and what it might look like now as compared to the period covered in this book?
Alyson, do you want to go first this time?
I don't think the concept has changed. It's a question of the application. And as I was trying to say, I mean, principles of partnership still maintain for all the things that we're facing now. And I think perhaps when you talk about the climate crisis, our need is actually for partnership with people in the secular world who are passionate about solving this problem as well. It's not just a church thing, as we know. And this is also a generational question where younger people are much more inclined to be engaged politically and so on because of the world that they are about, that they're already in, but that they're going to inherit the worst of. And I think our recalling what partnership is all about and reminding our churches that this is our primary calling to be partners in God's mission of healing and restoration, that absolutely applies to the situation with climate. I regret that we don't visit each other anymore, but we also have new resources, like here we are on Zoom. And there's new ways of making connection if we take the time and effort to do that. That's just off the top of my head. Ian?
I would go to the same place, Alyson, that you. First of all, I think you're absolutely correct, Jesse. It was a generation ago, and if I may, Alyson, it was your and my generation. So the Partners in Mission, of course, part of its invitation was to have the sisters and brothers in Christ from around the communion come and spend time within one's context, and then offer insights and opportunities for learning, as Alyson noted when she was visited in Canada during the Partners in Mission consultation for the Church in Canada. Churches participating in what were known as PIM consultations were great opportunities for learning. It didn't completely eschew the colonial economic constructs where even during PIM consultations in the historic churches in the West with more financial resources, they sometimes could easily be reduced to shopping sessions, if we want to be honest about the interactions. Yet there was something to be said about embodied connection. I mean, we do believe in an incarnate God, and actually sharing physical proximal space is vitally important as far as being literally in communion one with another and sharing sacramentally together, worshiping together. Alyson noted that now with technology, we have this great vehicle to be able to be in conversation, and we haven't all gathered together in Montreal to fete and celebrate Ellie, and we're able to do that from the comfort of our own homes and studies. That's a good and great thing. And as Christopher Dreising has noted in the first wave of globalization, globalization had the twin realities of both bringing us closer together in global economic orders and recognitions of the environment, and while at the same time exacerbating differences and driving us apart. I think global technology and communication, instead of, or as a option to embodied partnership relationships, can do the same. While it gives us a great opportunity to come together, it also has a temptation for us to only communicate with those who are of our kind. We're not forced to engage differences as deeply as we are when we're embodied. And so I think the invitation before us is how do we in this medium try to lift up and celebrate and engage differences when electronic social media generally tries to tend towards the ghettoization of opinions and thoughts and peoples. So we're in partnership in a new way. And I think that while it allows for easier access and perhaps greater democratic sharing of voice, it also exacerbates and strengthens the walls of isolation between communities and peoples, as we only communicate with those who think like us and share our own political or ecclesiastical opinion. So it's a dangerous time. And it's significantly different than it was when we had to get on planes to sit down and meet one another.
Great, thank you both. Well, let me open it up. Are there other questions or comments or provocations or comments from in response to what we've heard, or that are on people's mind?
I just wanted to say I would love to read the book. It sounds fascinating. I really like that it covers issues like eco-theology and social justice and the history of the church. I like some of the topics that were even brought up in this Zoom, like for example, allowing same-sex marriages. I think that's really important. There's a lot of really good points being brought up even in this Zoom. And I
Great.
think DI would be a nice place to go because I think it sounds very progressive and open-minded.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And we try. Sue, I see your hand raised. Sue Wynn, one of the contributors. Over to you. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Sue.
Thank you. So many memories are floating through my head. I think my life in partnerships and my life with Ellie began in 1992 at an event called the Worldwide Anglican Encounter in Salvador, Brazil. I think there was 36 women from Montreal who gathered at that event. There were between 700 and 800 people there. Talk about flying a distance and being with people in person. It was certainly an eye-opener for me. And following that, I went down to a diocese that we were partnered with. Montreal was partnered with the Southwest Brazil. In 1998, I went to my first General Synod, and that was when I became a member of Eco-Justice. I stayed on it for some time. I was the chair for a while. And Ellie and I became very good friends, as she did with many of you, which is such a privilege. And I couldn't help but think that if there was a theme song for Ellie, it would be Gordon Light's beautiful, draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. She took us many places. She took the Eco-Justice Committee up to Kingfisher Lake, where we really had an experience of living with Lydia Mamakwa before she was a bishop, and that was a wonderful experience. Later, I had an opportunity, thank you to Henriette, who replaced Helly for a time, to go up to Inukjuak up in northern Quebec. Certainly those visits, now we could do it with Zoom, but those visits really changed my life. So I continue to hope that we draw the circle wider and wider still. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and especially for those examples of what we were just talking about, that embodied and incarnate communion with other people. Auger, I see your hand. Auger Beauvoir.
Yes, thank you, Jesse. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be part of this Zoom this afternoon to say, and it's good to remember Ellie Johnson. She was my boss for 3 years at Church House. And Ellie was that kind of person that you can go to at any time. I started working for Ellie in August 1996. In 1997, after a trip of Archbishop Michael Pierce to East Africa, we went to Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania for a month. During that visit, we talked about the situation in Rwanda and how difficult it was for Canterbury to deal with that, to get a solution to the situation of the bishops of Rwanda being in exile. There was a Bishop David Burney from the States trying to work with them, and things were not moving. Early 1997, Michael Pierce called me to his office and said, you know, since you speak French and you are Black with them, let me call ABC, Lambeth Palace, to tell them Canada is going to take care of that, to try to do something, because we are going nowhere. And he said, okay, go. I'm going to talk to Ellie. Also, I'll call Andrew Duca and the Archbishop. From his office, I went to Ellie's office. Ellie said to me, we need to prepare that trip to Rwanda. We sat down 2 weeks later. And for somebody who didn't study theology or mission, she helped me to map out what I should be doing in Rwanda. And before I left, she said to me, you need to start by building trust first. There's no partnership without trust. And that's how the Canadian Church helped the communion to solve the problem of the bishops in Rwanda who then go back or refuse to be part of any solution. And Ellie knew about partnership and mission. Her influence in that field goes behind our church here. So thank you to Maylanne and Ken and all of the contributors for this book. We remember somebody who made a significant contribution in terms of keeping the communion together. I did global partnership in the communion for 9 years. 6 with Canadian Church, 3 with Canadian Church, and 6 with the Episcopal Church with Trinity Wall Street in New York. I have 5 mentors, 5 people help me to understand partnership. Michael Pierce, Ellie Johnson, John Rye, Jamie Callaway, and Judy Gillespie. In terms of partnership and mission, 3 women were well respected from North America. Ellie Johnson was one of them. The other 2 were Judy Gillespie, who worked for the National Church in the States, and the former presiding bishop, Catherine Jeffers Shirley. Well respected. The Africans may disagree with them, but they are well respected. So to remember Ellie this afternoon, it's a great contribution that her ministry deserves from us. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Jeff Gallagher joining us from New York, another contributor. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you. Just briefly, reflecting on what I've been hearing the last few minutes and so on, just a wonderful conversation. But it's just becoming really apparent that how important, critically important it is for us, given the state of the world at the moment, to rediscover what partnership can mean and what the different forms that it can take at a time when our Mother Earth needs partnership perhaps more than ever before in all of human history. And that has just become really clear to me listening to what you're saying. And I want to thank you for that. And thank you to Ellie. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Perhaps one way to take the idea of partnership is partnership with the non-human creation as well, not just partnership with other people, but partnership with all of creation. Other comments? Yes, sorry, whose hand do I see? Barbara.
There. I just had some difficulty unmuting. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces and to think about Ellie. And one of the things that I noticed in the book was the emphasis on Ellie paying attention to people's lives. And I have a memory of her paying attention to my life. I think this was before I had begun working at Church House in Faith Worship Ministry, but I was doing postgraduate studies at Trinity in liturgy and worship, and I'd already met Ellie, I guess, through Gordon, but she had invited me to coordinate worship at a Jubilee conference in Peterborough. And one of the things she said to me, that there'd be an honorarium, but she said, I know you'll have childcare expenses because I had school-aged children at home. And she said, and so we'll cover your childcare expenses. Well, I mean, nothing like that had ever happened in the church in my life, in my ministry, or, you know, in different places. And for her to care about, you know, different dimensions of people's lives. And then when you pay attention to their lives, then that leads to advocacy. And then as Alyson was pointing out, like then there's partnerships with secular organizations. So if we're looking at homelessness, or if we're looking at toxic drugs, or if we're looking at climate change, we have to start with people's lives and then be willing to partner with whoever shares in that caring and advocacy. Anyway, lovely to be with you all.
Henriette.
Thank you. And I would also say lovely to be with you all. I succeeded Ellie in the role of the Director of Partnerships role. And I had 2 amazing weeks of onboarding, as they call it now, with Ellie and with the staff of partnerships as well. But rather than, you know, sort of having all this bottled up anxiety about taking over the work of someone who had been doing it for a long time, I just remembered lots of conversations with Ellie in her office, and a very relaxed way of learning more about the priorities of the work, partnerships in mission and eco-justice, that were the 2 main areas. And Sue Wynn, of course, was also a wonderful mentor and member of Partners in Mission. But Ellie had, I think some of you have reflected on this already, but a very down-to-earth way of handing off the torch and sort of feeling relaxed that it was the work of God in the church was going to continue, and that it would require the efforts of a diversity of people with a diversity of gifts. And so I just so appreciated those 2 weeks. Subsequent to Ellie's official retirement, her daughter Emily and I were attending the same church, Anglican church in Georgetown, St. George's, Georgetown. And so occasionally I still got to see Ellie, which was wonderful, and to see her with her 2 granddaughters and then with her daughter and son-in-law. So I missed her a lot in the first few years after having met her for the first time. And now I'm really glad that this book captures so many of the dimensions of the life of the church and of the spirit at work in the church, and captures a sense of the context and the times in which that happened. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Henriette. I want to just pick up on a theme that I hear from a couple of people here, and I raise it with a little bit of hesitation, but I am hearing it from a couple of people, which is, I think, the theme of gender. And we've heard Bishop Auger tell us about the important role that women played in modeling partnership for him. And Ellie was the first person, the first woman to hold that position, I believe, in the General Synod office. And earlier, Ian Douglas was commenting on that perspective as well. And I just wanted to maybe put this question more directly back to Ian and Alyson. And we sometimes talk in the Anglican Communion about the crises of the Anglican Communion are around gender and sexuality, but often that conversations about sexuality. I hate to gender essentialize, but in what ways does Ellie as a woman, how does that shape the witness that she brought both to the church and to the broader Anglican communion?
In Christ, there is no male or female, so I don't think it really matters. I don't think gender is really that important in the eyes of Christ.
All right, thank you, Nicole. So that's one perspective. Ian and Alyson, I wonder if I can hear from you on that.
I'll go first this time, Alyson. Right? let the guy speak on gender
That's
first, right?
You just mansplained, Ian. There you go.
Exactly, right. I'll just mansplain it away. I think the first thing to know is that historically in the West, in the United States, and actually in North America, the majority of missionaries have been women. And it was women's work for women, as it was known in the late 19th and early 20th century, was a larger movement for women, even larger than women's suffrage and the temperance movement, which were the other two large women's movements. So while historians, unless you read people like Dana Robert, have overlooked that fact, Ellie stands in a long line of women, and because of the sexism of ordination and the fact that clerics could only be men up until mid 20th century and on, lay women in particular were historically key leaders in not only Anglicanism, but think of the Mothers' Union, for Pete's sake, that all too often that's neglected acknowledgement. So Ellie is not, in that regard, an aberration. She stands in a long line of leaders in missionary movements who are women, and I would underscore also lay women. It's just that too often within the institutions of power, and here we're talking about whether it's appointments to staff positions and or commissions, the realities of sexism and clericalism and racism tend to favor people who look like me rather than people who look like Ellie. So I think noting that, and I think Ellie would have us note that she was a strong lay woman, was a significant part of her witness and the contributions she had to make. And I didn't want us to lose that in this conversation.
Absolutely. And of course, we have in this country a long history as well. I wrote an article some years ago about the bishop's messengers, who were an order of lay women who came from England and worked on the prairies, primarily working with other women, providing Christian education and so on, up and down the beginning railways through Manitoba, for example. And when the first women were ordained priests in this country, it was the women who had been bishop messengers who were the first ones ordained in the Diocese of Brandon, and no one objected to that. There was a lot of fuss around some of the other ordinations in this country at the beginning, but not there. And one person famously said, "Miss Hill's getting ordained? I thought she was already ordained." They broke the paths for us in many, many significant ways. I also have to pay tribute to a long line of our primates, because Howard Clark and Ted Scott and Michael Pearce were always affirming of the ministries of women, lay and ordained.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. Other questions or comments or stories here? I thought I saw a couple hands flickering, but I can't always see everybody on the screen all at once. So if you're trying to raise your hand, it's sometimes best to just use the raise your hand function on Zoom. Yes, Nancy, go ahead. You're muted still, Nancy. Nancy, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry about that. I'm Nancy Hearn. I did a chapter on the residential schools, and Ellie had brought me into, I didn't report to her directly, but to the general secretary, and her demonstrating on so many fronts about how to be a Christian woman, but also how to be a Christian leader and to deal with the very sensitive issues of the residential schools and the place of the church and the mission, that the change in the mission from the residential schools and the interest in managing that change. And it was all done in such a human way. But I think one thing that we didn't talk about yesterday at the launch, but I think is really important, is that Ellie and others followed and tried to live out the apology made by the primate. And I think that was central to her actions and Jim's actions, Jim Boyles, the general secretary, and many others. And watching her carry that out in various forms, with meeting with Indigenous people face to face, but then also with church leaders and speaking internationally. Her humanity came through so clear, and God meant for her to be in that position to negotiate on behalf of the church. She walked that line very well, I thought. And I admire her greatly. I work with the archives of the. When you begin to study their records and understand what they were trying to say, and then trying to capture that in the various essays in the book, I mean, the ones that are based on history, but also on her understanding of mission, is just amazing to see. And I am honored to have been, a little bit of a part of it. And she definitely impacted on my life and inspired me, as did Terry Riley and Alyson, so many people in the church, Maylanne. It just goes on and on. But yeah, you're right, the great women who've led that passage. But I just think about Ellie in the context of the apology to the Indigenous people and the way the church has handled it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Holly, over to you.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm listening to this fascinating conversation, and I'm thinking of Ellie. I did not know Ellie well, but what strikes me is she was trained as an anthropologist, and that is clearly a theme in her approach that is running through the kinds of comments that have been made. Certainly it doesn't capture all of Ellie, but I'm curious as to how she became a Christian. And I don't know that history, or how she related being a Christian woman, an Anglican woman, to her training and education as an anthropologist.
Good question. Anybody have an answer to that one?
One thing I might say, just in response to that, was her daughter spoke yesterday, and I found it quite powerful. She's been acknowledging the value of the book to herself and dealing with her mother's passing, and how Emily, her daughter, had put together her faith in God through her mother, and that it was such an important relationship. And then when her mother passed, it felt very hard to go back to church, and she couldn't quite understand her relationship with God at that point. So the book has brought some meaning to that part of her life. But yeah, her role, and she attended the St. Simon's in Oakville. I don't know about her early life really, and I know she was overseas, but in Kenya, was it? I think. Anyway, though how that led from her anthropology might be something her family could say, or some of her closer friends. But anyway, that's just what I wanted to say about her daughter yesterday.
So, Holly, I think you would enjoy Ellie's two chapters at the end of the book where she speaks with her own voice. I don't know the origins of her being or becoming a Christian, but I do know, I think that her time in Kenya and
Honduras?
Nigeria and
Honduras?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're related, I think, to her husband's work, and her presence there was as an educator and certainly as in the role of a reflective anthropologist. But what is interesting is the story that she tells of how she became an employee of the church. So circumstances led to her return to Canada with her daughters and husband. They needed to supplement income, and she had a dream. And the dream was about the employability of educators in the church. And what she dreamt was actually presenting herself to a United Church who didn't have employment for her, but sent her down the street to the Anglican Church. And she describes that as a dream that actually unfolded almost exactly as she anticipated it. So I invite you to explore that more. And if ever the opportunity came up to speak with one of her daughters, you might find a deeper story.
How prophetic.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for these stories and these comments and these questions. We're just coming close to the end of our time, and before we do, I want to give the last word to Ken Gray, the other co-editor of the book. Among other things, Ken can tell us how to get a sale price on the book if you don't already have a copy. But Ken, perhaps a closing word from you about what brought this book to be, and I think also your hopes for it now that it is out there in the world and in the church.
Thanks, Jesse. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Good. Thanks, Jesse, for your chapter. It was very inspiring. Thanks for your recommendation of the publisher, Whitf and Stock. The first publisher we talked to said yes, so we didn't have to look any further afield. Did want to introduce a bit, although Nancy has introduced herself as the author of the first chapter in section 3, which deals with Ellie's involvement with the residential schools response, especially in the support of Indigenous persons. We sometimes assume, those of us who think we're in the know, that everybody knows what we know. The truth is they don't. In the parish I serve in the Diocese of Kootenay, many people are not aware of the background or the foundation of our church's response to the horrendous suffering experienced by Indigenous Anglicans and Indigenous persons in general. I do want to remind folks that Alyson Barnet-Cowan didn't produce a chapter, but she was one of the eulogists at Ellie's funeral, and her comments are included in the first section. And to the point about Ellie's childhood experience with faith and such, yeah, that is, I thought about it the other day, and that is a bit of an unknown question. I would also, in addition to turning you, as Maylanne did, to Ellie's own words, as Maylanne suggested, I think, turn to, in particular, one of the eulogies from one of Ellie's longtime friends who was at the launch yesterday, Verna Andrews, and also turn to the daughter's stories. They spoke very movingly of their mother, and I can't remember who it was who knows Emily well and her daughters. Emily and one of her daughters came up yesterday, and Emily had a book because she had one already. And I just got the sense that the daughter, that is Ellie's granddaughter, would like a book too. So I said to her, "Do you promise to read at least part of the book?" And she nodded her head, and I just gave it to her. So it was a lovely moment. Her legacy continues in her own family. In my first chapter, the first chapter of the book, I talk about the opportunities which Ellie and Maylanne together opened up for me. When I went to General Synod 2001, I bluffed my way onto the Eco Justice Committee. And then I found myself at a meeting in Scarborough, and I remember phoning my wife saying, "I don't know why I'm here. I don't want to be here. I want to come home." Things improved over the next few days, and I found a welcome from the group, and I found a place for myself. 6 months later, I was in South Africa at an event that Jeff Gollier produced, and he is on the call today and wrote the final chapter. Jeff is the Assisting Minister Provincial for Anglican Franciscans in North America. He's a well-published author, especially on the spiritual journey, and he worked at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York during the 1980s when he and his team there, including the dean, whose name I've forgotten, but anyway, they were 20 years ahead of the rest of us and the church with regard to responding to the climate crisis. Jeff, it was that conference that opened up so much for me. And yet from that conference, I phoned home and I said to my wife, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't want to be here. I want to come home." And I cried. Years later, I revisited that same place, and the phone booth was still there, though the phone had been ripped out. So things had moved on. You were asking about the book purchase, and I'm very pleased to say that the book is being purchased. It's a bit expensive, I have to say, once you do the conversion from US to Canadian dollars. But friends, today and for the next few weeks, you can contact the Wipf and Stock. By the way, the names are two surnames of two booksellers who decided to come together, Mr. Wipf and Mr. Stock. And if you order from the publisher at the time of purchase, if in the coupon section, you insert the word in capitals, mission, MISSIO, and you will receive a 40% discount. By the time shipping is added, and don't ask for any fancy shipping, just the ground shipping, it will be very close to 30 Canadian dollars, which is what we've been selling it for here in Canada. Next steps is a good question. A lot of our energy today and much of our energy yesterday has focused on appreciation of the work, ministry, and presence of Ellie Johnson in our midst. And that is fantastic. I think these are stories. Her story needs to be told, that of a lay woman. Many stories told of Canadian Anglicans are concerned with white male clergy. Many of those stories are magnificent, including Jim McCollum's biography of Ted Scott. But these are not the only stories which need to be told. And I asked several people yesterday, think about what other Canadian stories, biographical or otherwise, should be told. Can't promise you that I'll take up the project in any way, but you never know. I am, however, concerned to take the material found in section 4, some which is a bit abstract, some which is a bit less so, talking about mission and how it is planned, implemented, strategized, and incorporated into the life of our church now and into the future, how that mission is shaped, presented, promoted, and supported. There is this endless struggle, at least I felt it since 2001, a bit of a tussle between social justice and ecological justice. And we've talked in this call about the most pressing mission needs of our day. I think, frankly, the environment, the climate crisis is going to trump everything. Apologies for using that word, that was unintended. Nevertheless, the next decade or two is possibly going to reshape literally the face of the earth. Projects which I think are responding to this very effectively and specifically include Salal and Cedar Watershed Discipleship in the Diocese of New Westminster. Laurel Dykstra was on the call earlier. I'm not sure if she is still on, but I hope in a future book or some sort of media project to celebrate these projects, these examples of mission in our own day. Finally, a word of thanks to Maylanne. We were a good team. In many ways, I'm a starter, she's a finisher. I go to the broad picture very quickly, and she goes to the detail. She took at least one of my manuscripts, which was in frightful condition, and shaped it into something which was quite useful. We had to work out some details. We have very different operational and communication styles, but together, I think with gratitude and pride that we have been able to assemble a fine book, I dare say. And I'm so glad that people are engaging with it and enjoying it and having conversations around it. So with that, I'll thank Jesse again for hosting today. Thank all of you for being on the call. And I'll hand it back to Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being here. I want to just conclude by thanking you for your interest in your stories today and your comments. And I do want to say a word of thanks to both Ken and Maylanne for your efforts in bringing this to fruition. Two of my beliefs about the life of the church right now is one, that we could be a bit more historically informed, especially about our recent past history, and so that we're not always reinventing the wheel. And you've done a very fine job here of bringing out into the open documents that might otherwise be lost in archives. So thank you for that. And another belief of mine is that in the church, we would do well if we could engage with ideas at slightly longer length than the length of Facebook posts or tweets, and even by sharing and writing books with one another. So I want to thank you for offering this book to the whole church, and conclude with the hope and the prayer that the church will receive it in the spirit that it was intended, and take forward these ideas as we discern the future towards which God is calling us. So thank you to Ken and Maylanne. Thank you to all of you. And above all, thank you to Ellie for being the inspiration to so many of us and to this book project. Thank you for being here, and have a great evening.